The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. Read by Ben Barnes. Introduction. Listeners are advised that this introduction makes the detail of the plot explicit. On 20 June 1890, the Philadelphian Lippincott's monthly magazine published Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray as the lead story for its July number. Wilde revised and enlarged this, his first and only novel, for appearance in book form the following April. Hitherto, the 35-year-old author had published a book of poems, 1881, largely ignored or ridiculed, had had one play produced, unsuccessfully in New York in 1883, published a book of fairy tales, 1888, on the whole well received, and had published some essays and stories in literary journals. Wilde had reviewed many novels and discoursed on the art of the novelist in The Decay of Lying. Now was his chance to practice what he'd been preaching and to fulfill the great potential his profile had promised when he graduated from Oxford and set about promoting himself in London's literary society. The Picture of Dorian Gray, published in the first year of the decade that would see him feted as the most successful society playwright of his day, and then pilloried as the most infamous sexual outlaw of the time, was his first significant and successful major work of art. Characteristically, this was a success to scandale. His novel provoked, at least in Britain, an outraged response from many reviewers, providing a foretaste of the treatment he would receive 5 years later when what some believed they had found represented in Dorian Gray, outlawed passions and unspeakable acts, were revealed to be part of its author's life. Indeed, Wilde's novel, or at least the more candid first version, was used by opposing counsel in the first 2 of his 3 trials in an attempt to prove that he was guilty of a certain tendency believed to be represented in Dorian Gray. In 1890, W. E. Henley's Scott's Observer thundered, "The story, which deals with matters only fitted for the Criminal Investigation Department or a hearing in camera, is discreditable alike to author and editor. Mr. Wilde has brains and art and style, but if he can write for none but outlawed noblemen and perverted telegraph boys, the sooner he takes to tailoring or some other decent trade, the better for his own reputation and the public morals." 5 July 1890. The remark about noblemen and telegraph boys refers to a recent scandal, last mentioned in the press only 2 months earlier, involving a homosexual brothel in London's Cleveland Street, and was therefore a fairly direct suggestion that Wilde's text was unambiguous in what it described. Questions of the role of art in its relation to morality and to the author's life dominated debate about The Picture of Dorian Gray at the time of publication. In Wilde's response to the reviewers, and in a number of critical works published shortly afterwards, and again at the time of his trials. They dominate it still, for it is difficult to discuss the novel outside of this framework or without an awareness of subsequent events, but this is understandable. To a great extent, Wilde's text encourages such debate, with its central conceit of a work of art that somehow confesses to its creator's desire and bears testimony to a life of immorality or crime. Some of these issues, of art and morality, of censorship and interpretation, of deception and revelation, will be discussed in this introduction to a work that is very much a product of its times, but which still fascinates readers over 100 years after its first publication. Double lives and secret vices. There are certain temperaments that marriage makes more complex. They are forced to have more than one life. Lord Henry in Chapter 6. Oscar Wilde, artist, Irishman, dandiacal mocker of the standards of his society, was also a gentleman, and was acutely aware of what this meant and defensive of his right to this title. His father was an eminent surgeon who was knighted for his services to science. His mother, despite her radical Irish nationalism, a celebrated society hostess. Oscar was educated at Portora, a famous Irish public school, and attended both Trinity College Dublin and Oxford University, Ireland's and England's oldest universities. At the latter, he took an excellent double first and came close to being awarded a university fellowship, thus very nearly becoming a member of the English academic establishment. By 1890, he had been married for 6 years and was devoted to his 2 sons, lived in the fashionable district of Chelsea, and at various times belonged to a number of gentlemen's clubs, which, with their systems of election and blackballings, were exclusive bastions of the metropolitan gentlemanly idea at the time. When Wilde came to revise Dorian Gray for book publication, he made a last-minute change, substituting the name Hubbard for the original Ashton for the picture framer who visits Dorian. Why? Because Ashton is a gentleman's name, whereas Hubbard particularly smells of the tradesman. More seriously, when Wilde engaged his counsel for his first trial and was asked by Edward Clarke if he would give his word as an English gentleman that the allegations were not true, Wilde assented. Wilde would therefore have agreed with the words he gave to Basil Hallward in his tale when the latter asserted that every gentleman is interested in his good name. And yet, like Dorian, Wilde had for some time been indulging in activities that were illegal and vilified by respectable society, and which therefore forced him to live a double life. As one biographer puts it, after 1886, he was able to think of himself as a criminal, moving guiltily among the innocent, being initiated into homosexual acts by his friend Robert Ross in that year. While in 1890 he had not quite abandoned himself to the reckless behaviour he would later term feasting with panthers, de profundis. He had had a number of homosexual encounters and identified himself as a member of a clandestine subculture. The theme of a double life of outward respectability, or at least of caring about one's reputation while secretly transgressing society's moral codes, is central to the plot of Dorian Gray. Dorian may emulate Lord Henry's dandiacal disdain for established pieties, but even his response to Basil's accusation that he has made Lord Henry's sister's name a byword, "Take care, Basil, you go too far," chapter 12, suggests that he does have some regard for his reputation, or the opinion of others. As the text states, he was not really reckless, at any rate in his relations to society, chapter 11. Dorian in fact relishes his ability to indulge in his immoral, illegal, or just plain shady activities whilst escaping the consequences. We are told how. Often, on returning home from one of those mysterious and prolonged absences that gave rise to such strange conjecture, he himself would creep upstairs to the locked room, open the door, and stand with a mirror in front of the portrait that Basil Hallward had painted of him, looking now at the evil and aging face on the canvas, and now at the fair young face that laughed back at him from the polished glass. The very sharpness of the contrast used to quicken his sense of pleasure. He grew more and more enamoured of his own beauty, more and more interested in the corruption of his own soul. Chapter 11. And when he appears at a society gathering not 24 hours after committing a treacherous murder, we are told that Dorian felt keenly the terrible pleasure of a double life. Chapter 15. The passage describing Dorian's subsequent trip to an opium den that same evening effectively conveys his divided existence. At first, the cabbie refuses to take him so far from his usual beat. Bribed into making the excursion to the docks, he loses his way in the labyrinth of unpaved courts and alleys so far removed from the well-lit, police-patrolled squares of Mayfair where Dorian lives. This area by the docks to the east of London was terra incognita for many Londoners, where the ruined Adrian Singleton, who was believed to have left the country, could escape from society, and where Dorian could indulge his cravings for opium and obscurity. And yet, while such passages serve to establish a socio-economic as well as a topographical distance between Mayfair and Ratcliffe, ruling class and outcast, Wilde's novel in part suggests that such divisions are not rigid or absolute. High life and low life are often conflated in Dorian Gray. Culture and corruption, chapter 19, are not disparate but congruent areas of experience. Dorian passes easily from an appreciation of the gracious shapes of art, the dreamy shadows of song, the preserve of the rich and cultivated, to relish the coarse brawl, the loathsome den, the crude violence of disordered life, the very vileness of thief and outcast, chapter 16, suggesting a close parity between these realms. Lord Henry makes this explicit when he asserts to Dorian that crime belongs exclusively to the lower orders. I don't blame them in the smallest degree. I should fancy that crime was to them what art is to us, simply a method of procuring extraordinary sensations. Chapter 19. The criminal and the aesthete, combined in the figure of Dorian, stand together in Wilde's text. However, Wilde's novel goes further in blurring the distinctions between high and low, respectable and outcast. For while this supposed affinity between art and criminality, idle hedonism and actual delinquency would not shock or trouble a large portion of the respectable and industrious classes at the time, who suspected as much and had their suspicions confirmed in some learned quarters, Lord Henry's rapier wit threatens to indict a much larger section of the social spectrum. The dandy's epigrams provide a glimpse of the world Wilde would soon dissect in his social comedies, where a guilty past or present is the norm, and nearly everyone indulges in some degree of bun-burying. As Dorian reminds Basil, we are in the native land of the hypocrite. Therefore, while Dorian constitutes an extreme combination of cultivation and corruption, the embodiment of the idea of decadence, in some respects this supreme hypocrite is, as Henry puts it, the type of what the age is searching for, and what it is afraid it has found. Chapter 19. By suggesting that duplicity is an essential part of existence in late Victorian society, and that Dorian is an extreme version of an unacknowledged norm, Wilde's novel resembles that other great fantastic tale of doubling and transformation published 4 years earlier, Robert Louis Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde, 1886, a work which Wilde knew and admired. Dr. Jekyll creates a potion that transforms him into the criminal and bestial Mr. Hyde. This potion effectively divides his nature, giving his less upright twin, as he terms Hyde, release from the constraints of social conformity, and allowing Jekyll himself to still walk the path of righteousness. Hyde provides Jekyll with an alibi, indulging in violence and, unspecified, debauchery which horrifies his more respectable side. As Jekyll puts it, I was often plunged into a kind of wonder at my, i.e. Hyde's, vicarious depravity. But what is most troubling about Stevenson's tale is the suggestion that although the means of this physical division are clearly fantastical and the results extreme, the experience of Dr. Jekyll is far from unique. His divided self, it is implied, was a common experience among members of his class, a world of ordinary secret sinners, as he terms it. Recognizing that man is not truly one, but truly two, Jekyll merely contrives the means to make this division concrete. In short, the claims of respectability necessitated Hyde. Long caged, he came out roaring. We must bear in mind that until its final pages, and for its first readers, Stevenson's Strange Case involves not one person but two. It records friends' various attempts to understand the relationship between two of the most unlikely companions, what the lawyer Utterson calls Jekyll's strange preference for the grotesque thug Hyde. Utterson is determined to discover why his respectable friend is honouring Hyde's checks, protecting him from the law, and has even made him the principal legatee in his will. Perhaps most worrying of all, he has set him up in an apartment in Soho, a distinctly shady part of town. Blackmail is suspected, and blackmail was a fact of life for middle-class homosexuals at the time. Indeed, the law that eventually convicted Wilde, which was passed the year before the publication of Stevenson's tale, was known as the Blackmailer's Charter, allowing male prostitutes and domestic servants to extort money from their employers or clients. Wilde himself was subjected to a number of blackmail attempts. However, while all speculation about the respectable physician's relationship with Hyde is brilliantly dispelled at the end in Jekyll's full statement of the case, when it is revealed that two people are actually one, Wilde's novel, especially the first published version, is more ambiguous. Unlike Stevenson, Wilde does not provide a full statement to clear up any speculation about why Lord Henry and Dorian should take a house together in Algiers, a well-known retreat for homosexuals at the time, or why Dorian's friendship is so fatal to young men. As a consequence, it provoked the outraged response referred to above. Many reviewers believed they understood what Wilde was describing, and Wilde, despite his bravura and readiness to respond to the prurient reviewers with a flat denial of any suggestion of immorality in his tale, may have feared that he, like Basil, had put too much of himself in his work of art. Perhaps he had. Codes and revisions. Wilde loved secrets and mysteries. When he joined the Freemasons at Oxford, Part of the attraction was its code of absolute secrecy and the arcana of its rituals. His short story, The Sphinx Without a Secret, tells a tale of exactly that, a woman who surrounds herself with an aura of mystery and acts out an elaborate charade merely for the love of mystery. At the premiere of his play, Lady Windermere's Fan, 1892, Wilde is reported to have arranged for a select group of friends, as well as a member of the cast, to be wearing green carnations in their buttonholes, suggesting a subculture of conspirators. The Picture of Dorian Gray perhaps wears a few green carnations of its own. It is certainly a coded text, directing those in the know to understand its hints and suggestions. The name Dorian itself is perhaps a coded reference to Greek love, the historical and pedagogical euphemism for the homoerotic practices that were a part of everyday life in ancient Greece, but which were glossed over or vilified by Victorian teachers of the classics. By calling his principal character Dorian, Wilde is perhaps hinting at the Greekness of his relationship with the two older men who agree that he was made to be worshipped. And when Wilde claimed that of all the characters in his novel, Dorian was the one he most wished to be, but in other ages perhaps, he was perhaps wistfully alluding to the fact that he would be Dorian, Greek, in a Dorian age, an age which sanctioned what, to quote Lord Henry, his own monstrous age had made monstrous and unlawful. Other names have potential significance. At times, the historical references with which the text is conspicuously laden amount to a roll call of famous homosexuals. In one passage, which ostensibly catalogues Dorian's interest in jewels, there is a reference to the suit of armour which Edward II gave to his lover Piers Gaveston, and to the earrings worn by James I's favourites. Indeed, as we learn later, one of these favourites was Philip Herbert, Dorian's ancestor, who was caressed by the court for his handsome face, a circumstance that makes Dorian speculate on the influence of heredity and wonder whether it was young Herbert's life that he sometimes led, chapter 11, a coded reference perhaps to the fact that he may share similar tastes to this favourite of a king notorious for his homosexual lifestyle. Indeed, one of the most telling signs that Wilde had not been sufficiently circumspect in his depiction of male relationships in his novel was the nature of many of the revisions he made when the novel appeared in book form in 1891. Wilde had already made a number of changes in the process of transferring the novel from manuscript to typescript, cutting out or modifying even more explicit material, so he may not have been entirely surprised by some of the more forthright reviews. When he revised the book for volume form, he went further. In the 1890 version, there had been a much greater degree of physical intimacy between the principal male characters. In Chapter 1, when Basil Hallward tells Lord Henry about his beautiful new friend, Henry lays his hand upon Basil's shoulder. This seemingly innocent or inconsequential gesture Wilde chose to omit in 1891. Perhaps he felt he had gone too far and could not risk being either too explicit or too ambiguous about these relationships. Thus, despite defiantly asserting that what Dorian Gray's sins are no one knows, in a letter responding to the Scots Observer's insinuations about the Cleveland Street scandal, he nonetheless chose to dispel some of the mystery surrounding Dorian's activities when he revised the novel the following year. In Chapter 10 of the first version, Basil visits Dorian to implore him to deny the most dreadful things that are being said about you, things that I could hardly repeat to you. Basil then refers to a number of scandals in which Dorian appears to be implicated and asks him, "Why is your friendship so fateful to young men?" In the first version, Dorian declines to answer any of these allegations, keeping his sins vague, and his responsibility for the ruin of young men a matter of readerly speculation. In 1891, however, he answers these charges, absolving himself of responsibility for the actions of others. These turn out to involve monetary fraud and misalliance, and are hardly the unspeakable crimes some readers or reviewers might have suspected. The most significant changes in this respect involve the role of the portrait in the relationship between the artist and his model, where the physical becomes the ideal, and the aesthetic bears the burden of or provides a mask for the erotic. This is most markedly exhibited when Basil explains to Dorian what his portrait revealed to its creator and what he feared it might proclaim to the world. This is how it appeared in 1890. It is quite true that I have worshipped you with far more romance of feeling than a man usually gives to a friend. Somehow I had never loved a woman. I suppose I never had time. Well, from the moment I met you, your personality had the most extraordinary influence over me. I quite admit that I adored you madly, extravagantly, absurdly. I was jealous of everyone to whom you spoke. I wanted to have you all to myself. I was only happier when I was with you. When I was away from you, you were still present in my art. In 1891, Basil's reference to never having loved a woman, as well as his mad, extravagant and absurd devotion, is replaced by a more Platonic interpretation of the artist's need for his model. Dorian, from the moment I met you, your personality had the most extraordinary influence over me. I was dominated soul, brain, and power by you. You became to me the visible incarnation of that unseen ideal whose memory haunts us artists like an exquisite dream. I worshipped you. I grew jealous of everyone to whom you spoke. I wanted to have you all to myself. I was only happy when I was with you. When you were away from me, you were still present in my art. Chapter 9. It is now Dorian's personality that dominates Basil's soul, brain, and power. His adoration or worship is transformed into a philosophical quest for a chaste and literally Platonic ideal of art. According to Basil, this aesthetic adoration communicates itself to the painting. In 1890, however, this process was interpreted rather differently. Then Basil explained to Lord Henry that he would not exhibit the painting because he had put into it all the extraordinary romance of which, of course, I have never dared to speak to him. In 1891, this is changed to some expression of all this curious artistic idolatry. The portrait no longer runs the risk of revealing Basil's romantic attachment to Dorian, making him believe he had put too much of myself in the thing, as he earlier put it. It is now merely the physical manifestation of an artistic ideal. Significantly, the unmodified versions of these passages were read out in court in 1895 in an attempt to prove that Dorian Gray was a perverted book, thus confirming Basil's lament that art is too often regarded as a mode of autobiography. Magic paintings. While the theme of a young man selling his soul in exchange for eternal youth is not new, as Wilde confesses, it is an idea that is old in the history of literature, Mason 72. The Picture of Dorian Gray offers an intriguing and highly original treatment of this idea, principally owing to Wilde's brilliant conceit of the portrait, which masks Dorian's life. This is not to suggest that magic, animated or somehow revealing portraits were unknown in the pages of popular literature. They had been a stock feature of fantastic fiction since its earliest days. One of the marvellous and terrifying events which takes place in Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, 1764, the first Gothic novel, is the figure of Alfonso stepping down from his portrait, a portentous sign that Manfred's days at the castle are numbered. A little-known and decidedly extravagant tale from 1812 entitled Family Portraits by Jean-Baptiste Benoit Herrier, which owes much to Walpole's novel, also anticipates aspects of Wilde's own magic portrait. In Herrier's tale, the portrait of the evil Dittmar is imbued with moral significance as manifested in its physical appearance. It was painted by a ghost as an emblem of Dittmar's crimes, depicting his soul in all its ugliness, and, as in the denouement of Wilde's tale, it reverts to a more attractive form once expiation for these sins is accomplished. The idea of a fatal correspondence between a painting and an individual's life, the former being parasitic of the latter, had been brilliantly handled in Edgar Allan Poe's story The Oval Portrait, 1845, where the artist's obsession with capturing absolute life-likeness in paint eventually destroys his model, the wife worn out by the arduous sittings for her portrait. Portraits proliferate in Victorian Gothic and sensational novels, revealing dark secrets about their subjects. Wilde's novel follows suit, featuring not one revelatory portrait merely, but a number of earlier ones which, it is suggested, have some link to their pictorial descendant. Chapter 11 of the 1891 version tells how Dorian would visit the portrait gallery of his country house and contemplate the pictures of his ancestors. Each one has a tale to tell, encouraging Dorian to speculate on the inheritance of sin and shame bequeathed to him by those whose blood flowed in his veins. Standing before a particular portrait, he wonders whether it was young Herbert's life that he sometimes led. Had some strange poisonous germ crept from body to body till it had reached his own? Was it some dim sense of that ruined grace that had made him so suddenly and almost without cause give utterance in Basil Hallward's studio to the mad prayer that had so changed his life? This is a powerful and intriguing suggestion, providing a Gothic but also scientific explanation for Dorian's actions. It suggests that he is haunted by his ancestral legacies rather than being entirely motivated by his own personal vanity. His portrait therefore bears not only the consequences of Dorian's own sins, but is also the culmination of an ancestral line. For as Dorian reasons, man was a complex, multiform creature that bore within itself strange legacies of thought and passion, and whose very flesh was tainted with the monstrous maladies of the dead. Through such emphases, Wilde gives a fantastic and supernatural twist to an idea that was a staple tenet of scientific thought at the time. Dorian is invoking the idea of hereditary reversion, which is explained by the eminent mental pathologist Henry Maudsley. Now and then a person may detect in his own face in the looking-glass a momentary flash of expression of the sort which will be found formal in the portrait of an ancestor. Beneath every face are the latent faces of ancestors. Beneath every character, their characters. Wilde supernaturalizes scientific belief, providing an occult dimension to the correspondence between physical appearance and character, and the transference of ancestral legacy. This scientific frame of reference is conspicuous in his novel, especially in its revised form, where heredity plays a crucial role in explaining character and motivation. Wilde added a whole chapter in 1891, Chapter 3, to provide some details about Dorian's immediate ancestry. Here we learn that his maternal grandfather was a mean dog who was suspected of bringing about Dorian's father's death. His mother, who had married beneath her, thus invoking her father's revenge, makes an appearance in the portrait gallery in the revised version, thus reinforcing the suggestion that heredity in part explains Dorian's own actions. Dorian resembles his mother physically, Chapter 11, while the transformed portrait starts to resemble the wicked grandfather. There would be the wrinkled throat, the cold, blue-veined hands, the twisted body that he remembered in the grandfather who had been so stern to him in his boyhood, Chapter 10. Physically and morally, Dorian is a product of his heredity. His criminal tendencies derive from his grandfather, from a long line of debauchees, while his intention to marry the lower-class Sybil Vane suggests that he is in part reverting to maternal type. For as Dorian himself asserts of the Duke of Berwick, with such blood as he has in his veins, how could his record be clean? By stressing the role of heredity in Dorian's actions, making him a scientific rather than a moral study, Wilde was bringing the theme of the Faustian bargain up to date, giving it a degree of plausibility, at least with regard to his motives, and diminishing Dorian's moral responsibility for his actions. As the narrator puts it, there are moments, psychologists tell us, when the passion for sin, or for what the world calls sin, so dominates a nature that every fibre of the body, as every cell of the brain, seems to be instinct with fearful impulses. Men and women at such moments lose the freedom of their will. They move to their terrible end as automatons move. Chapter 16. Such a view is very much in line with contemporary debate on responsibility in mental disease, the title of an important work on the subject, and how forms of criminality were a consequence of degenerate ancestry similar to Dorian's. For as Wilde's Gilbert would assert in The Critic as Artist, also published in 1891, the scientific principle of heredity has shown us that we are never less free than when we try to act. It has hemmed us round with the nets of the hunter, and written upon the wall the prophecy of our doom. We may not watch it, for it is within us. We may not see it, save in a mirror that mirrors the soul. As Dorian's portrait is at one point referred to as the most magical of mirrors, which would reveal to him his own soul, Chapter 8, it can be suggested that heredity provides a key to his actions and a scientific alternative to the moral emphasis which Wilde complained was too obvious in the 1890 version of the novel. Visible vices. This scientific dimension to Dorian Gray suggests that it is really only the impossible conceit of the portrait's transformation that makes Wilde's tale supernatural or fantastic. The central motif is framed and informed by so much that was materialistic and plausible in contemporary thought. This also applies to the notion of bodily metamorphosis and the physical consequences of moral causes, a belief that is fundamental to Wilde's narrative. Once again, what happens to the portrait is only fantastic because it happens to canvas and paint rather than flesh and blood. The belief that underlies this transference was far from implausible at the time. Physionomy, the widespread belief that an individual's appearance, particularly his or her face, reveals character, plays an important part in Wilde's novel. A version of this logic is first encountered in its opening pages. Here, Lord Henry expresses the hope that Dorian's extraordinary good looks are not matched by intelligence. For as he reasons, intellect is in itself a mode of exaggeration and destroys the harmony of any face. The moment one sits down to think, one becomes all nose or all forehead or something horrid. This idea espouses, but also plays with, fundamental physiognomic assumptions. A Roman nose and well-developed forehead were generally considered positive attributes, indicating the intellect and moral probity associated with the learned professions, which Henry goes on to disparage. Look at the successful men in any of the learned professions. How perfectly hideous they are. However, Wilde also plays with this notion insofar as the physiognomic and phrenological registers to which he refers were usually understood to be fixed, and certainly not susceptible to the instant modifications suggested here. The broad forehead, denoting a pronounced development of cerebral faculty, determined the life of the intellect rather than vice versa. This somewhat flippant discussion of physiognomic ideas, of course, anticipates the focus on bodily metamorphosis, which Dorian, or at least his portrait, undergoes, where actions do produce hideous physical consequences. And yet this belief also had currency in some contemporary scientific and pseudo-scientific writings which help to explain the central conceit of Wilde's fantastic tale. Basil articulates a version of this logic in chapter 12 when he confronts Dorian with the rumours that have been gathering about his life. As Basil reasons, sin is a thing that writes itself across a man's face. It cannot be concealed. People talk sometimes of secret vices. There are no such things. If a wretched man has a vice, it shows itself in the lines of his mouth, the droop of his eyelids, the moulding of his hands even. It is this logic that allows Basil and others who have heard the rumours about Dorian to be duped for so long. This is hardly surprising, as what Basil asserts was very much an article of faith, and can be found in a number of writings from the period. Basil refers to secret vices, something that preoccupied medics and moralists throughout the 19th century. Nearly all the writings on what was euphemistically referred to as self-abuse, from cheap pamphlets sold by quack practitioners to serious monographs on mental disease or urinary or venereal disorders, referred to the peculiar appearance of those who indulged in this practice. As one distinguished physician records of a young man who had sought his professional help to cure him of the effects of this vice, he still retains the peculiar physiognomy which to me is very characteristic, or as another physician claimed of a similar case, the expression on his countenance was at once repulsive, comical, and weird. These writings suggest that certain immoral practices produced physical consequences on the body, signs that the informed could identify. Indeed, as Samuel Tissot, the most influential authority on the subject, asserts of those who are addicted to the practice and are exposed to its supposed consequences, when the veil is withdrawn, the picture of their conduct appears in the most hideous light. It is a frightful picture and makes one shudder. As Tissot's pictorial imagery suggests, Wilde's narrative operates within a similar framework of expectations about certain secret vices and their frightful consequences. Again, it is only the supernatural intervention in this process that inhibits what was eminently plausible to a large section of his readership at this time. His fantastic conceit literalizes the physician's metaphor, eventually revealing the picture in its most hideous light. The rotting of a corpse in a watery grave was not so fearful, chapter 13, while the mad prayer and the locked attic prevent the public from detecting what would clearly be manifest, Dorian's sins, whatever they might be. The portrait. The portrait of Dorian may be the vehicle for a fantastic plot device, the repository for ancestral memory, a metaphor or mask for erotic desire, or the alibi for a life of secret vices. But it is also a work of art, and therefore occupies an important place in Wilde's text and oeuvre. For Wilde made his public debut as a professor of aesthetics and made art, its relation to life and conduct, and its correct interpretation, the dominant theme of most of his writings and public pronouncements. These concerns are explored in Dorian Gray, a novel in which a painting, rather than its subject, is the eponymous character. From the first pages, Basil's painting is the object of interpretation and potential misreading. Basil, its creator, is also its first interpreter. As seen earlier, he believes that his portrait of Dorian actually reveals more about himself than the sitter. As he protests, "We live in an age when men treat art as if it were meant to be a form of autobiography." And because he believes the portrait reveals the secret of his own soul, he resolves not to exhibit it. Dorian's response to works of art is similarly subjective. When he encounters the curious yellow book which Lord Henry lends him, he sees in its hero a kind of prefiguring type of himself. And indeed the whole book seemed to him to contain the story of his own life, written before he had lived it. Chapter 11. Similarly, when he attends a performance of Wagner's opera Tannhauser, he sees in the prelude to that great work of art a presentation of the tragedy of his own soul. Chapter 11. Dorian clearly demonstrates the maxim found in the preface, which Wilde wrote for the revised edition of the novel. It is the spectator and not life that art really mirrors. Works of art therefore act as subjective mirrors in Wilde's novel. This is preeminently the case with Dorian's relationship with his own portrait. On one level, this is obvious and understandable. After all, there is more reason why Dorian's extremely lifelike portrait should mirror him rather than its creator. However, the reflection here is more moral than physical. It serves as a moral ledger, recording his transgressions according to the pseudo-scientific beliefs of the day. Dorian, who, as we have seen, is apt to read art subjectively, is first and foremost a critic of his own portrait. When he first believes that the painting has altered in response to his actions, he is once again reading his own life into a work of art. Such things were impossible. It seemed monstrous even to think of them. And yet, there was the picture before him, with the touch of cruelty in the mouth. Cruelty. Had he been cruel? Chapter 7. Given Wilde's professed views on art and nature, art and life, and art and morality, it is significant that Dorian's monstrous reading is detrimental to the painting. Some of these views help to illuminate the central incidents of Dorian Gray. Wilde's The Decay of Lying, January 1889, is principally a protest against realism in the aesthetic realm, disparaging poor, probable, uninteresting human life, while asserting that all bad art comes from returning to life and nature and elevating them to ideals. For Wilde, art should be a veil rather than a mirror. These strictures against bringing life to art find their moral counterpart in Wilde's portrait of the art critic and poisoner, Thomas Griffiths Wainwright, Pen, Pencil and Poison, January 1889. Here he makes one of his first assaults on the tendency to bring ethics to aesthetics. The fact of a man being a poisoner is nothing against his prose. The domestic virtues are not the true basis of art, though they may serve as an excellent advertisement for second-rate artists. Such views would become central to Wilde's thought, being the principal theme of his preface to the revised edition of his novel, and in many of his works of criticism published subsequent to it. As he protested to the reviewer of the St. James's Gazette, the sphere of art and the sphere of ethics are absolutely distinct and separate. For Wilde, art is superior to nature and to life, and aesthetics are always higher than ethics. However, although his most forthright statements on this theme appeared as a consequence of his experience with the critics of his novel, especially those dealing with art and morality, the earlier works referred to indicate that Wilde held these views prior to its publication. These views also inform his novel, which he called a reaction against the crude brutality of plain realism, Mason 74. This is found in Wilde's depiction of Dorian and his criticism of the painting, for Dorian brings his moral life to the portrait, confusing art with life and ethics with aesthetics. The result is disastrous for the work of art. What should have been hailed as one of the greatest things in modern art is transformed into a horrifying record of corruption, bestial, sodden and unclean. What did it matter? No one could see it. He kept his youth, that was enough. For Wilde, perhaps this destruction, a form of aesthetic heresy, is Dorian's greatest sin. As he stated in the preface, Those who find ugly meanings in beautiful things are corrupt without being charming. This is a fault. A similar illustration of the disastrous effects of life on art and of confusing ethics with aesthetics is found in the tragic tale of Sybil Vane. Dorian Gray falls in love with a beautiful young actress whom he discovers performing in a seedy third-class theatre. From the outset, it is clear that he is in love with Sybil's acting rather than the woman herself. As he enthuses to Lord Henry, "Tonight she is Imogen, and tomorrow night she will be Juliet." "When is she Sybil Vane?" asks Lord Henry. "Never," Dorian replies. Dorian intends to take his love out of poetry and to find a wife in Shakespeare's plays. "I have had the arms of Rosalind around me and kissed Juliet on the mouth." Sybil plays all the great romantic heroines of the Shakespearean stage, and while she remains within the sphere of art, her performance enraptures Dorian. Life, in the form of the real passion she feels for Dorian, ruins her art. "Dorian, Dorian," she cried. "Before I knew you, acting was the one reality of my life. I knew nothing but shadows, and I thought them real. You came and taught me what reality really is. I might mimic a passion that I do not feel, but I cannot mimic one that burns me like fire." Chapter 7. Dorian's cruel response is consistent with his aesthetic code. Without your art, you are nothing. A third-rate actress with a pretty face. That night, Sybil commits suicide, and Dorian detects the first changes in his portrait. However, despite the moral censure suggested by the portrait's reaction, Wilde discourages such a straightforwardly sentimental response to these circumstances. To do this, he points to the artificiality of Sybil and her experiences. As Dorian exclaims to Lord Henry, "How extraordinarily dramatic life is. If I had read all this in a book, Harry, I think I would have wept over it. Somehow, now that it has happened actually and to me, it seems far too wonderful for tears." How is the reader, who does read about Sybil's death in a book, supposed to respond? Perhaps Lord Henry's interpretation points the way. "You must think of that lonely death in the tawdry dressing-room simply as a strange, lurid fragment from some Jacobean tragedy, as a wonderful scene from Webster or Ford or Cyril Tourneur. The girl never really lived, and so she never really died. Mourn for Ophelia, if you like. Put ashes on your head because Cordelia was strangled, but don't waste your tears over Sybil Vane. She was less real than they are." Chapter 8. Henry is being true to his cynical and amoral self, but he is actually speaking the literal truth and offering a view that is consistent with Wilde's own views on art and ethics. This is not to say that Wilde encouraged his readers to adopt Lord Henry's amorality in their own lives, but he is pointing to the fact that Sybil is a literary creation and should be regarded as such. To encourage this response and detract from the pathos of her death, Wilde makes the scenes with Sybil, especially in the revised version, as artificial as possible. In Chapter 5, which he added in 1891, we find Sybil living in a fairy tale world with a mother who plays life as she once played the melodramatic stage, constantly adopting striking poses and acting to an imaginary gallery. Her brother James is also characterized in this way. As Sybil exclaims, "Oh, don't be so serious, Jim. You are like one of the heroes of those silly melodramas Mother used to be so fond of acting in." Sybil, who regards Dorian merely as a person in a play, Chapter 4, decides that he is really Prince Charming, and echoes Tennyson's Lady of Shalott when she complains, "I have grown sick of shadows." This all points to her artificiality as a creation, suggesting that an aesthetic rather than sentimental response to her death, for Dorian, one of the great romantic tragedies of the age, is more appropriate. In depicting the experiences of Dorian and Sybil in this way, Wilde provides an illustration of the basic tenets he propounded in his statements on art, that art is destroyed by life and morality, and that ethics and aesthetics belong to separate spheres of thought and judgment. His novel is in part an allegory of interpretation and an essay in critical conduct. Despite their specific historical references and contexts, scientific, homoerotic, aesthetic, which can help to illuminate many of the themes of Wilde's novel, providing a background to its reception, revision, and subsequent history, it is a book that continues to fascinate readers of all ages over 100 years after its first publication. For at the centre of the narrative is a study of an individual struggling with the consequences of his actions and coming face to face with the reality of his soul. Wilde's study of conscience and corruption can also be understood in both metaphysical and psychological terms. Dorian, who emulates Lord Henry's cultivated cynicism and adopts the course of amoral hedonism the dandy prescribes, nevertheless is compelled to believe that the soul is a terrible reality. It can be bought and sold and bartered away. It can be poisoned or made perfect. There is a soul in each one of us. I know it. Chapter 19. It is a powerful and disturbing conceit that Wilde employs to depict this recognition. The portrait that Basil Hallward had painted of him would be a guide to him through life, would be to him what holiness is to some and conscience to others, and the fear of God to us all. Here was a visible symbol of the degradation of sin. Here was an ever-present sign of the ruin men brought upon their souls. Chapter 8. Dorian decides to ignore the lesson provided by this recognition, choosing to believe that the portrait would free him from the consequences of his actions. But Dorian is never free. Thus, despite his worship of and unbridled indulgence in pleasure, he cannot escape from his fascination with the portrait, constantly examining his soul with an obsessional intensity to rival the sternest Puritan or the most ascetic anchorite. He grew more and more enamoured of his own beauty, more and more interested in the corruption of his own soul. He would examine with minute care, and sometimes with a monstrous and terrible delight, the hideous lines that seared the wrinkling forehead, or crawled around the heavy sensual mouth, wondering sometimes which were the more horrible, the signs of sin or the signs of age. Chapter 11. Conscience, whether one reads that in sacred or secular terms, is strongly delineated in the novel. Dorian believes that he has destroyed conscience, but in truth it destroys him. The portrait had kept him awake at night. When he had been away, he had been filled with terror lest other eyes should look upon it. It had brought melancholy across his passions. Its mere memory had marred many moments of joy. It had been like conscience to him. Yes, it had been conscience. He would destroy it. Chapter 20. Thus, although the central conceit of the physical consequences of certain acts is informed by beliefs peculiar to the time, Wilde's depiction of how this process affects Dorian has the power to fascinate and chill readers in an age that has discarded such beliefs, and can recognize in such descriptions an outline of what now might be termed paranoia. Dorian Gray is in part an acute study of obsession and psychological collapse, depicting a mind destroying itself with its own obsessions. The Picture of Dorian Gray is therefore a work that can be read in a number of ways. It is an enduring parable on the corruption of the soul and a study of psychological collapse, a compendium of the beliefs of its period, and an exercise in literary decadence, conspicuous in its exotica and esoteria, and defining the zeitgeist of the so-called fin de siècle. Finally, it is also in part a comic novel, and in the revised version especially Wilde, the humorist, a role equal to homosexual martyr in the public mind today, perfected the arts of epigram and sparkling dialogue before transferring them to the stage. In Chapter 15, Lord Henry observes of Madame de Ferrol, "She is still décolletée, and when she is in a very smart gown, she looks like an édition de luxe of a bad French novel. She is really wonderful, and full of surprises. Her capacity for family affection is extraordinary. When her third husband died, her hair turned quite gold from grief." Wilde recycled this line for the importance of being earnest, a practice he repeated often at this time. Such passages significantly enrich the novel, making it a more enjoyable and durable work of art, of comparable stature to anything he produced for the stage. Lady Windermere's Fan, 1892, which also reuses epigrams from the novel, appeared the year after the revised version of Dorian Gray and launched Wilde's extraordinarily successful career as a dramatist. At the time of his public downfall, he had 2 plays playing to packed audiences in the West End. His ostracism was swift and conclusive. First, his name was taken from the hoardings of An Ideal Husband and The Importance of Being Earnest. Soon both plays were taken off, and an imminent US tour of A Woman of No Importance was promptly cancelled. On 25 May 1895, he was sentenced to 2 years' imprisonment with hard labour. In November, he was declared bankrupt. His wife changed her name to Holland, and on his release from Reading Jail, Wilde changed his own name to Sebastian Melmoth, martyr and wanderer, and left England forever. He died in poverty in Paris in November 1900. And yet today, Wilde's plays have never been more popular with audiences all over the world, and the book you are listening to is one of the best-selling titles in the Penguin Classics series. If Dorian Gray does have a moral, we can perhaps find it in its final paragraph. The work of art, which has been subjected to hostile moral readings, shamed obscurity, and finally physical harm, remains intact in all its beauty and wonder.